If I were to ask you, what is the smallest soldier to have been awarded a medal in the Second World War, your guess might not go as low as 9 ounces. Homing pigeons have been used in war since antiquity, but their role continued surprisingly well into the era of mighty machines. And the wartime contributions of homing pigeons is history that deserves to be remembered. Fossil evidence suggests that the rock dove, Columba livia, the wild bird that is most commonly called simply a pigeon, originated in Southeast Asia. But the species has had such a long association with humans that it is today impossible to determine its original range. In fact, most experts assume that the pigeon is the world's oldest domesticated bird, with its domestication mentioned in both Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets and Egyptian hieroglyphs more than 5,000 years ago. Domesticated as both food and as pets, humans have spread the species far and wide, and millions of the domesticated pigeons have become feral, interbreeding with their wild counterparts, to the point where the bird's range covers nearly 5 million square miles, and the European population alone is estimated to be as high as 28 million. 5,000 years of breeding resulted in many fancy breeds. The ability to breed for traits fascinated, among many others, Charles Darwin, who owned a flock and was a member of pigeon clubs. Pigeons impacted his work, and he used them as examples of variation of animals under domestication. While many were bred for decoration and some for food, others were bred to select for the species' extraordinary capacity for homing. Homing is an inherent ability of an animal species to navigate towards an original location through unfamiliar areas. Homing can be used in migration, a way to return home, common in birds, but also salmon and loggerhead sea turtles, and the tiny red-bellied gnu, which at just 3.5 inches long, will travel sometimes miles over rugged terrain to return to the same spot in a stream. Homing in pigeons is a bit of a mystery, as the rock dove is not migratory, but the pigeons do have an ability to return home to their mate and nest. The most popular theory is that homing pigeons use magnetoreception, navigation by using the Earth's magnetic field, although the exact mechanism for how they detect the field is still a matter of debate, and some studies have found pigeons are able to return home even if the magnetic field is disrupted. Other cues, from olfactory navigation to navigating by visual landmarks, has also been suggested. In fact, it is possible that different types of homing pigeons use different types of navigation. But whatever the mechanism, homing is an exceptionally easy characteristic to breed for. You simply let the birds out and only breed the ones that make it back. The incentive to breed for the homing skill came from the sport of pigeon racing, releasing pigeons to see which returns to its nest the fastest. While it isn't clear exactly when the sport was developed, it was at least well established in the time of King Solomon, some 3,000 years ago. The homing skill could be effective over enormous distances, with some races occurring over distances in excess of 1,000 miles, and with sustained speeds in excess of 50 miles per hour. The corollary to pigeon racing is the pigeon post, the use of pigeons to send messages, where their speed and homing ability made them superior to almost all means of communication before the electronic era. There is record of Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, using homing pigeons to communicate across the vast Persian Empire some 2,500 years ago, and pigeons were used in ancient Olympic games to alert a winner's hometown of their victory. The use of a pigeon for post has a limit in that, in general, the pigeon only homes one direction, and has to be physically moved to the second location, and their size limits the size of the message they may carry. However, by placing their food in one location and their nest in another, pigeons have been able to be trained to fly back and forth between two locations over distances as much of about 100 miles. A version of a pigeon post was active in Baghdad at least as early as the 12th century, and a pigeon post was used by Genghis Khan to keep track of his empire in the 13th century. Pigeon posts were used as late as the 19th century between the California mainland and the town of Avalon on Catalina Island. A homing pigeon service in the 1890s between Great Barrier Island and Auckland, New Zealand, called a pigeongram, issued stamps, making it, some argue, the first real airmail service. The rare stamps are highly prized today by philatelists. Less successful was a late 19th century pigeon post used for marine search and rescue in Nova Scotia, where pigeons were flown from lighthouses on islands to the mainland. Because of the harsh conditions, the pigeon suffered a high mortality rate. When Paris was besieged by the Prussian army during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and 71, Parisians communicated with the outside world using pigeons, and the Prussians employed trained hawks to disrupt the service. As microphotographs had been developed in the 1850s, pigeons could carry hundreds of messages on a small roll, and more than 1 million messages were sent via pigeon during the 4-month siege. Given their reliability and speed, it's not surprising that homing pigeons have been used in time of war. In the 10th century, Olga of Kiev, the regent of Kievan Rus, demanded a tribute of 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house from the besieged residents of the Drevlian city of Iskorostan in exchange for ending the siege. Instead of ending the siege and bringing peace as promised, she had a small cloth of sulfur and pitch bound to each bird, and when they returned to their homes, they set the city ablaze, burning it to ashes. During the Second World War, behaviorist B.F. Skinner theorized that a pigeon could be conditioned to recognize a target and drive a glider laden with explosives, essentially pecking on a control when the glider moved off target. While this early attempt at a guided missile attracted some military interest, the so-called Project Pigeon was eventually abandoned as being impractical when compared to competing projects. In 1908, a German apothecary named Julius Neubauer developed a small camera that could be set with a timer and attached to a pigeon for the purpose of aerial photography. The German army investigated the military potential, but by the Great War, aerial technology had developed to the point that airplanes were a better platform. Still, the idea persisted into the Second World War, when the German army apparently trained dogs to carry a pigeon in a basket behind enemy lines. The pigeons then flew back to the German lines with cameras that took photos at 5-minute intervals. While the Soviet army reported capturing a German truck that included cameras and equipment for pigeon photography in 1942, it's unclear how much they were actually used. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency developed a pigeon camera during the 1970s for use during the Cold War. Reports are that the pigeons would be dropped from airplanes. The details of the camera and the results of the program are still classified. But the most successful use of war pigeons was as a messenger. The use of messenger pigeons in war is ancient, and there are several references in Roman texts of pigeons being used by Julius Caesar to communicate with his armies during the Gallic Wars. Hannibal took pigeons with him to keep Carthage appraised of his progress as he crossed the Alps. When the British defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, a pigeon was the first to carry the news of the victory to London. By the 1800s, pigeons were an established part of every major European army. The greatest use of pigeons in war was during the Great War. On the cusp of the electronic age, the war featured old and new technology. Where conditions made it impossible to string wires and radio technology was undependable, pigeons were a relatively reliable form of communication, with some claiming that they achieved a success rate of more than 95%. Estimates are that as many as 500,000 pigeons were utilized during the war. Pigeons were an important part of the new technologies of the war. Aircraft and tanks were fast-moving and often discovered urgent information to carry back to headquarters. Radios of the day were too large and unreliable to be carried, and pigeons were carried by both, as well as by warships. When the U.S. first deployed tanks under Major George Patton at the Battle of St. the lead company sent a pigeon named President Wilson back to headquarters with a map of the location of German machine gun nests. Pilots found that they could throw pigeons out at any altitude and they would successfully fly home, although you had to throw them carefully to keep them from hitting parts of the aircraft. Pigeons were such an important means of communication on both sides that troops would shoot at them, knowing that they were carrying messages. Some troops were issued shotguns for exactly that purpose. In at least one case, an American spy camouflaged a white pigeon named Babette with soot, so it would appear to be a crow, making it less likely that the Germans would target it. The pigeon made it back to headquarters with information about a German attack, allowing the Allies to thwart the attack with artillery. A pigeon named Le Cirque was credited with capturing a German submarine. When a French beach watcher sighted a German periscope off the coast, Le Cirque got a message back to Naval Command so quickly that British and American destroyers were able to trap the submarine and force it to surrender. When the famous Lost Battalion of the U.S. 77th Infantry was trapped behind enemy lines during the Battle of the Meuse in 1918 and cut off from other means of communication, a pigeon named Cher Ami, or Best Friend, flew through enemy fire to alert command as to the battalion's location. The timely message saved the battalion from a misplaced Allied artillery barrage that was dropping on the Lost Battalion and allowed the Allies to advance enough to withdraw the battalion. Cher Ami carried the message 25 miles in 25 minutes, despite having been wounded by German fire, having lost a leg with a hole through her breast. For her courage, she was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French. Surgeons saved Cher Ami, including providing her with a wooden leg. She was returned to be part of the Army breeding program, and after her death in 1919, was taxidermied and is on display at the Smithsonian Institution. Despite the advance of radio communication, homing pigeons still played a vital role in the Second World War. The Royal Air Force carried pigeons with bomber crews, where they were reliable means of informing headquarters when a plane had crashed. The RAF estimated that 1 in every 7 of its bomber crewmen who were rescued after being shot down over the ocean were rescued as a result of a message sent by a pigeon. In one case, the crew of a Beaufort bomber shot down over the North Sea in 1942 was rescued because their pigeon, a bird named Winky, managed to make it home despite being covered in oil. Winky didn't have a message attached, but the RAF were able to calculate the position of the downed aircraft using the time difference between the plane's ditching and the arrival of the bird. Pigeons were so valuable in airborne operations, where communication could be notoriously spotty, that the U.S. engaged a brassiere manufacturer to create a special sling so that a pigeon could be carried by a paratrooper. A cage with a parachute was also developed to allow planes to drop pigeons to isolated troops, and prior to the D-Day invasion in 1944, thousands of such pigeons were dropped throughout the countryside, asking French citizens to reply with information about the location of German forces. Pigeons played a vital, if almost unknown, role at D-Day, as there was a concern that radio communications were being monitored by the Germans. An Irish pigeon named Paddy was the fastest pigeon to return to England with news of the success of the D-Day landing, traveling 230 miles across the English Channel in less than 5 hours. For his speed in the delivery, Paddy was awarded the Dickin Medal, called the Victoria Cross for Animals, one of 32 pigeons to be so honored during the Second World War. Another pigeon to receive the award was G.I. Joe, who in November 1943 was able to successfully carry a message when all other means had failed. The Allies had called in an air bombardment on German troops in the Italian village of Colvi Vecchia, but the Germans had withdrawn at the last minute and the village had been occupied by British forces. The Americans realized their bombers were about to bomb Allied troops, but were unable to successfully raise command by radio. G.I. Joe made the trip successfully in 20 minutes, arriving just in time to call off the bombers. Pigeons dropped behind the lines with paratroopers were commonly used to communicate with resistance units. One such pigeon, named Commando, successfully completed more than 90 missions. The pigeons, carried in mobile dovecotes, were used on all fronts. A pigeon named Blackie Harrington successfully carried a message during the Battle of Guadalcanal regarding the location of Japanese troops, despite being hit with shrapnel that tore off part of his neck and chest. Surgeons were able to save Blackie, who spent the rest of his days in the breeding program. The underappreciated war pigeon is no longer used by most armies. The U.S. Army Signal Corps shut down their pigeon service in 1947, and the British Air Ministry Pigeon Section was shut down in 1948. But the Swiss Army maintained a pigeon section clear until 1996. There's been some indication that homing pigeons might have been used as part of asymmetric warfare in recent years, and pigeons have been caught being used to smuggle things into prisons. And there is a current concern that homing pigeons might be used as a method to deliver bioweapons. White doves, which are sometimes traditionally released as a celebration of weddings and at the opening ceremonies of Olympic Games, are actually homing pigeons that have been bred for their size and their color. And they're supposed to be able to return home, although because they haven't been bred for their homing ability, a distressing number of them don't make it. Still, it is an interesting irony that a technology developed for war has become an international symbol of peace and love. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.